we have a responsibility to educate our children, and that extends to our grandchildren as well. What about great-grandchildren? Well, based on how Rashi explains what happened with Yosef and his great-grandchildren, we'll get a very interesting insight. At the end of the parasha, Rashi comments on the pasuk that says that the children of Machir, son of Menashe, son of Yosef, were Yuldu. We'll see in a moment what that means. Al Birka Yosef, on Yosef's knees. On his Mefarish, Rashi explains what that means is Ketargumai, what Unkelus says, Gidlon ben Birkov, that Yosef brought them up between his knees. Now, what's Rashi addressing over here? But Pashas Landman, as by Rashi is Shver de Lashon Yuldu al Birka Yosef. So it would appear that what bothers Rashi is the word Yuldu, which sounds like they were born on Yosef's knees. Doesn't really seem to make sense. Vikem and Zogen, as Bnei Mocher seien geboren geworden al Birka Yosef. How could anybody suggest that Mocher's children were born literally on Yosef's knees? The Rabbi is Rashi Meforish, as Kavalas HaPosek is need, as is einen geboren geworden al Birka Yosef. Therefore, Rashi has to explain, it doesn't mean literally that they were born on Yosef's knees, nor as Gidlan ben Birkov, but rather that he brought up his great-grandchildren between his knees. But that still raises a question or two. Das Gufa, as the Pasuk made Gidlon Chule kemen learn of Tvei Oifanim. There are actually two ways that we could explain what the Pasuk is saying over here. One is taught by the Even Ezra, and one is taught by Unkelus. So Aleph, wie the Even Ezra learned, as the Taich von Yuldu Do is Gudlu. So the Even Ezra says that word Yuldu over here, which normally means they were born, in this case means they were brought up. Now that would have been simpler, and maybe Rashi should have taken that approach. But instead he takes the approach of Unkelus, which is based with the Targum Zocht of Yuldu al Birka Yosef. Rashi, Unkelus says, what does Yuldu mean? Is Yelidu, they were born. Rabbi Yosef, and Yosef brought them up. Was von dem is move on, as Rabbi Yosef is Shaykh und ist Dorfteich nicht von Yuldu, nor von al Birka Yosef. Which means that Unkelus is not translating the word Yuldu differently, as the Even Ezra does. He says Yuldu means they were brought up. But rather, Unkelus is translating the expression on Yosef's knees as they were brought up by Yosef. Or as if it is an abridged version of the pasuk. And the pshat is, and the way you should understand the pasuk is, that Machir's children were born, and after that, Vayu al Birkei Rabbi Yosef, then they were brought up by Yosef. He raised them. But Rashi does not take the approach of the Even Ezra, rather, as he says very clearly, Ketargumoi, he takes the approach of Unkelus on their far, and for that reason, you're going to see two things about Rashi that are very specific. Aleph is a neat matik in Dibra Maskan Demvort Yuldu. He does not include the word Yuldu in the headline of the Rashi because he's not explaining the word Yuldu. He's explaining the words Al Birka Yosef. While there is no Mefarish Diveret Al Birka Yosef. Second of all, Beis, as Ogdi Gidlon, he uses the expression that Yosef brought them up or raised them, nit gudlu, rather than the passive expression, they were raised. Was is matim to Yuldu, which would have worked better if he was translating the word Yuldu like the Even Ezra does. So now is Tomua, that raises a big question in our minds. Why does Rashi take the approach of explaining the pasuk as Unkelus does? As the pasuk is which then forces us into a situation to suggest that the pasuk is a contraction of what the pasuk is really trying to say. Why doesn't he take what would appear to be the simple explanation, like the Even Ezra, that the word Yuldu means they were brought up? And we can need and don't suggest that the answer is because Pshat doesn't really see the word Yuldu to mean Gudlu. Don't suggest that that's why Rashi took a different approach, because we have precedent for the fact that the word Toldois or Yuldu could mean other things besides just simply being born. Rashi himself in Parshas Bamidbar comments, is Mefarish Vela told us Aaron and Moshe, when it speaks about the children of Aaron and Moshe, and then only tells us the children of Aaron, is Mefarish Vela told us, Rashi says, V'nikru told us Moshe, that the children of Aaron are called the children of Moshe in that particular context, because he raised them in Torah learning. Because according to Pshat, it is acceptable to say that if a person raises somebody else's children in the ways of Torah, it is considered as if they gave birth to them. So clearly Rashi is not bothered by the word Yuldu meaning Gudlu. That's not the reason he took the approach of Unkelus. Zetman, so we're seeing that Pshat anticipates the possibility that giving birth to somebody includes spiritual birth, raising and educating them. Valachas kam v'chamen benin didan as also megadol given nit no benegat Torah ein prat nor in other pratim from Gilul Bonim. So if we're willing to use the word birth to refer to teaching somebody Torah, here we're talking about Yosef raising his great-grandchildren. That's more than just simply teaching them Torah. It would be acceptable in pshat to say that the word yuldu means to raise them. So that's not what's bothering Rashi and forcing him to go with Onkelos' explanation. The question is, what is forcing him to take the less pshat-like explanation of Onkelos? So the Bir Bozeh, the explanation is because Rashi has already dealt with this idea of on the knees as a means of raising somebody. Where did we see that? You may recall in Parshas Vayechi, Shteit Vatemer Rachel Gomer, Rachel says, Boy Eileha Bilha. She invites, because she can't have children, she invites Yaakov Avinu to marry Bilha. V'seiled al birkai, and she says, and you will then give birth to children on my knees. There's that expression again. Taich Rashi, there Rashi explains al birkai means ketar goboy va'ano arvei. Rashi there again refers to Onkelos and says what Rachel was saying is that I will raise those children that Bilhah gives birth to. Was dort kann man nicht lernen as the Teich von verteilt is vana arbe. It goes without saying that in that pasuk the word give birth to does not mean raise. Give birth means give birth. Bilhah will give birth to them. Weil der Wort verteilt verteilt sie wird geboren kann sich doch nicht beziehen zu Rachel, because there's nobody suggesting that the word verteilt in that pasuk is referring to Rachel. It's referring to Bilhah. Bilhah is going to give birth to them. The birkai is the part that's relevant to Rachel, and she's going to raise them. Muss man sagen. As in von Vana Arve is in the Vertal Birkai Far Zich. Therefore, already in Parshas Vayechi, we see that the concept of raising children is related to the words Al Birkai, which Rachel said, because she's the one who's going to raise these kids. Das says Veseda meint Leda Kipshuta. In other words, the word Veseda means give birth. That's Bilhah's job. Wie der Targum Teitstake dort Veseled Vesolid, as Onkelos translates the word there Veseled as giving birth. Bilhah vet geboren a kind, was vet sein al birkai ana arbe. So what Rachel is saying is, Bilhah will have a child, she'll physically birth the child, and I, Rachel, will raise him. But bald as the Parashat steht an ähnliche Lashon. So seeing as we have precedent already in Vayechi that al birkai means to raise somebody, and now our parasha is using the same kind of language, you'll do al birkai, as it says in our parasha, hat nicht genau zu sagen, als da soll Rabbi Yosef sein der Teich nicht von al birkai Yosef allein, nor from Wort yuldu. Therefore, it would not make sense over here that Rashi is interpreting the word yuldu to mean that Yosef raised them, when we already have precedent that the expression al birkai is the word that means that he raised them. Therefore, Rashi can't go with the opinion of the Even Ezra, who's translating the word yuldu. He has to go with the opinion of Onkelos, who's translating al birkai to mean that Yosef raised them. Therefore, Zokt Rashi, that's why Rashi says, as Dove in Parshas Vayechi, the term Parshas Vayechi, exactly as in Parshas Vayechi, is a Taich from Yuldu Kipshutai. We take the word Yuldu, give birth, as literal. Somebody gave birth to these people. On Al Birka Yosef is Ketar Gomai, whereas the expression on the knees, that's the expression that implies raising somebody, and therefore Yosef is the one who raised Macher's children. Now that we understand why Rashi is taking the approach of Onkelos, there are other questions that we have to address. Specifically the language that Rashi uses, which actually seems to be more language than is necessary. Aleph. Is typically Rashi takes the approach as that when he's quoting an explanation based on Onkelos, he normally just says Ketar Gomoy and then expects us to take a look and see what Onkelos says. He doesn't have to spell it out for us, whereas over here he does. Not only does he spell it out, if there is occasion where Rashi quotes the words out of Onkelos, he doesn't explain them. Here he does. In fact, take a look at Parshas Vayechi. When he quoted to Onkelos, then he just quoted the exact original Aramaic that Onkelos used. Here he does something different. He's not moving. That's what's not understood. Why here does Rashi not only refer to Onkelos, but not only does he quote the words from Onkelos, he translates them into Hebrew, Gid lon chule. Then in Hebrew he tells us that Yosef raised them. Void. And if, for whatever reason, Onkelos' words needed to be translated in Hebrew, why didn't he do it now? When he had the same quotation from Onkelos earlier in Parshas Vayechi, he should have translated it into Hebrew back then. Why not then? Why now? Question one. Question two is, the truth is it actually seems as if Rashi is saying the opposite. Base. Let's say for whatever reason here Rashi had to translate the word Varavi into the Hebrew Gidlon, that he raised them, isn't moving, it's still not understood. Why does he have to add the words between his knees? Al Birkei is in the pasuk already. Why do we need it to say in Rashi as well? And that's the part that's going to sound like the opposite of what Onkelos is saying. Gimel di Tmia in dem is noch starker. What makes this even more surprising is the Heisafel from Bein Birkov is a Cha'era in Stira to Targumai. The minute Rashi includes the words raise them between his knees, it actually sounds like he's saying the opposite of what Onkelos said. Why? Let's remember. By Mob Taichin Abirka Yosef Zaknit the Targum Rabbi Yosef Al Ruchovevecha Yosef Bazeh. Onkelos does not say that he raised them on his knees, which is what Rashi is saying. Therefore, is mashma Satan Targum is the period for Nalbreak and it keeps to be moving on Gashmi. No, das san Eisdruck was war died as a hotze megadol keven. In other words, Onkelos is taking the view that the word al birke is not literal. It doesn't have anything to do with his physical anatomy, with whether they're on his knees or not. It's a phrase, it's an idiom that we use to express raising somebody. That's how Onkelos positions it. Sounds like Rashi saying the opposite. As mitzuleg diverte bein birkov, when Rashi now adds the words that Yosef raised his children on his knees, then Rashi sounds like he's emphasizing not only that Yosef raised those children, but that they were specifically on his knees. That actually sounds like Rashi's taking the words al birkei literally, which is the opposite of Onkelos, who's saying it's just a turn of phrase, it's an idiom. So which one is it? Now, the easiest way to try and answer this would have been to say, and that that's exactly what Rashi wants to clarify. That even though it's not clear in Onkelos, Rashi wants to alert us to the fact that when Onkelos tells us that Yosef raised his great-grandchildren, he actually raised them literally on his knees. Because that's quite typical, that when you're raising or speaking to or educating a little child, very often they're sitting on your knee, and Rashi wants to draw our attention to that. Maybe that's the answer. And incidentally, that also explains a nuance, because the pasuk said that they were raised on Yosef's knees, whereas Rashi says that they were raised between his knees. What's the difference? Well, he's telling us need to know them gil because if you're raising and educating a child, it's not only in the very tender age where they're young enough to sit on your lap, but even when they're older and they're standing in front of you, so to speak, between your knees, and other standing face to face in front of you. Maybe that's the explanation. Rashi wants to draw our attention to a little bit more than what was obvious in the Targum Onkelos. But es bleibt aber nicht verstanden, but we still have two questions. Aleph. If Rashi has to explain this, as Aleph if Rashi needs us to know that even from Onkelos' perspective, who seemed to imply that Al Birka Yosef is a turn of phrase, it actually really also means on the knees. Un beis as al domain bein, and that the word on could also have a broader translation that goes beyond the age of sitting on the lap, and therefore Al Birkov could also mean bein Birkov. Back to square one. Why is Rashi only raising these issues now when he could have raised these issues where it was first relevant in the story of Rachel and Bilah back in Parshas Vayechi? So the explanation is this. The fact that Rashi adds this information, not just to say Ketargumai, look at Onkelos and you'll understand what the pasuk means, but specifying, and in Hebrew, that Yosef raised them between his knees. The reason Rashi is doing this is because there's a very compelling explanation offered by Targum Yonathan that you would have thought is the pshat, and Rashi needs us to understand it's not the pshat. Because Targum Onkelos translates it that Yosef was the one either who gave them a bris, or as we'll see in a moment, was the sandik at the bris. Yosef has given their sandik. That Targum Yonasan says on the knees implies that Yosef held them as the sandik at their bris, because that's typically how a sandik does it. He holds the baby on his knees. And the reason Rashi has to address this and say it's not the pshat is because actually suggesting that Yosef was the sandik at his great grandsons makes perfect sense according to pshat for two reasons. Well, first of all, because if you're looking for pshat, you want words that really fit with the words of the pasuk. And if the words of the pasuk are on his knees, and a sandik holds the baby on his knees, well, that's really pshat. He literally held them on his knees. And Beis, the word Yuldu is Galatikalot dem Pirish. And the word Yuldu, which means they were born, fits better with explanation that they are at their bris, which is soon after they're born. Leiden Targum Unclus came in Fregan, because if you go with Unclus's explanation, which is that he raised them on his knee, you have some questions. Why is the word birth relevant at the time that you're educating a child? Surely the only part that the pasuk needs us to know is that Yosef raised and educated them. In the same pasuk, because here it's talking about Menashe's children. In the same pasuk, when it speaks about Ephraim's children, it doesn't say that they were born and then Yosef saw them grow into the third generation. It just says he saw the third generation. And whereas if you take the approach of Targum Yonasan that we're talking now about their bris and Yosef being the sandik, well then well, then the word Yuldu that they were born is quite relevant because a bris happens, while the bris is later, very soon after the person is born. And Gimel Ve'ikir. It's actually a lot more logical to suggest that Yosef was the sandik of Machir's children, than to suggest that Yosef, who is running the country, the superpower of the world, nobody can move without his permission. It's quite a stretch to imagine that Yosef, with such a heavy schedule and so much responsibility, would have taken on the responsibility of educating his great-grandchildren. On their fire. So that's why you would have thought that the Targum Yonasan actually fits the pshat, and Rashi has to come along and say, no. On the far, therefore, even though in Parashas Vayechi, Rashi was quite happy to say, look at Unklus, you'll understand what's going on, Rachel is going to raise these children, and it's as simple as that. But here, when you reach this pasuk, because of the reasons suggested, that firstly, the word Yuldu lends itself to being close to their birth, and the fact that Joseph is probably too busy to educate his great-grandchildren, says Rashi, you would have thought we're going to go with Targum Yonasan, and you would have thought that it's about him being a sandik at their bris. Rashi says that's not the case. And in order to clarify that this is not the way to explain it, Rashi cannot just simply say we're going with Unclus, who says that it means he educated them. Now, but he spells out what that means to go with the opinion of Unclus. Gidlon chulei, that Yosef raised them. And the reason he does that is lehadgish, to emphasize, as the hechach to Zeit und doket Targum is nicht nur mit dem Targum und Zeit von divert al Birkei Yosef. Rashi is alerting us to the fact that we don't just arrive at this conclusion because of the words. Al Birkei Yosef are words which mean to raise somebody. No, from them teichen hakosav kidel kamon, we actually arrive at this conclusion because of the context. Look at what the pasuk generally is saying at this particular point in time. It will give us clarity as to what the message is about Yosef's relationship with Machir's children. So, where's the context? In Pasuk State, let's look at the full Pasuk. It says, Vayar Yosef Ephraim b'nei Sheleshim, that Yosef got to see the third generation of Ephraim's children. Gam b'nei Machir Menashe Yuldo Birkei Yosef, in addition to which, the children of Machir, the son of Menashe, were brought up on Yosef's lap. From there was the Pasuk said, Gam b'nei Machir goyim. Now the Torah over here used the word Gam. Also. It sounds like the Torah is telling us not only did Yosef get to see Ephraim's grandchildren, but more than that, something even more surprising is with regards to Yosef's relationship to Menashe's grandchildren. It's nicht moving. Das, was Yosef hat erlebt zu sehen, b'nei Sheleshim von Ephraim, und weißt du, für länger Meshach Zman, wie das, was b'nei Mocher beim Menashe, seinen Gebären geworden bechayav. Surely, the Chiddush is the other way. The fact that Yosef got to see Ephraim's grandchildren surely was later than having to do with Menashe's grandchildren. For two reasons. First of all, Machir ben Menashe. So Machir is a grandchild. Based from Menashe, and was given elter from Ephraim. And it's Menashe's children. Menashe is older than Ephraim, therefore his grandchildren and even great-grandchildren will be older than the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Ephraim. So surely it's more surprising then that he gets to see Ephraim's family. Why is the Gam, the Chiddush, pegged to Menashe? Well, that's exactly what Unclus clarifies for us. It's exactly what the Torah is telling us. The relationship that Yosef had with Ephraim's grandchildren was he got to see them, meaning to say he saw them born, and they were very, very young, obviously. The B'nai Machir ben Menashe is given the Chiddush. The great surprise about the children of Machir, child of Menashe, is was Yosef had to make gadol given that not only did Yosef see them, but he played a role in their upbringing. Was das meant to Bisra and Elter and Gil, which implies that they were obviously quite a bit older by the time Yosef passed away. Okay, that's noch mehr madgish sein as das setzt sich wegen Megadol sein Kid Bisra and Elter and Gil, and that's exactly what Unclus wants to illustrate to us. The pasuk is telling us over here that Yosef had an engagement with Machir ben Menashe's children until they were older. So to emphasize that, need for the b'nai Shilei Ephraim, not just like the children of Ephraim, the great grandchildren that he saw at a young age. Is Rashi Mosef as al Birka Yosef meant Bein Birkov. Rashi says, look at that. Not only did he hold them on his lap, but he even got into the point where they were standing in front of him. Vasos mein kenal dem Gidel in an Elter and Gil, which means he was part of their upbringing when they were already older. Now, for the pasuk Yud al Birkei Yosef, that pasuk that says that they were born or raised on Yosef's lap, no matter which opinion you go with, we can take out halachic principles from this. We're going to look at three. The first is this. The Alter Rebbe sagt in Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe says in Shulchan Aruch, that the time of entrance of the neshama, the nefesh elokis, into a child is at the time of his bris. And that's why we're so careful about a child from that age, that ideally, if you wash the hands, etc. Now what's interesting is, the Alter Rebbe does not tell us what the source of this principle is, that the bris milah is the time the neshama enters. There are certain suggestions put forward, including in the Rebbe's own sikha. In a previous sikha, the Rebbe explained, is in the Sefer Seder Hayoim, so there are various potential sources. Because they suggest the idea that a child has access to Olam Haba from when they have a bris, implying that the neshama enters them at that particular point in time, something the Rebbe has discussed previously. But here, the Rebbe says we have an even more primary source. There's a far earlier source to the idea that a child gets the neshama at their bris. What's that source? So the Targum Yosef says that they were born on Yosef's lap actually means that they had a bris on Yosef's lap. That means Targum Yosef is linking the time a child has a bris to the concept of the child being born, meaning the neshama entering them. Now surely having a bris is very soon after birth, but it's not the time of birth. But when you plug that in to the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, it all makes sense. Because the bris is the time the neshama enters, and that is similar to being born, and that might be the earliest primary source for the idea that the neshama enters at the time of the bris. Halacha perspective number one. Halacha perspective number two. There's another halachic perspective that we could see from Targum Yonasan about who could or can't be a sandik. We have a custom, you don't allow a person to be a sandik for two brothers. On the time therefore, what's the reason? Because the bris milah is compared to the avodas haketoros, and bakteros state and it says about the ketoros that they never repeated the same kohen to do the ketoros. Everybody got a turn, so you don't repeat the sandik in the same family. Fragt man if them from dem Targum Yonasan, but look at what Targum Yonasan said. Steht doch da as b'nei Machir gesinnin in Yosef. According to the Targum Yonasan, Yosef was the sandik for more than one of Menashe's grandchildren. As Yosef is given the sandik by b'nei Machir l'shein rabim, but instead Yosef was the sandik for the children plural of Machir. How could that be? Shleimas von dem is asmach zu divrach Sam Sofer. So we can now say that the Targum Yonasan gives weight to the opinion of the Chassam Sefer as a Mora de Astra can sein sandik by Mera Kinder from dieselbe Eltern, that if somebody is the Rav of the community, then they can be the sandik of more than one of the same siblings. Of a dogma saktaras, and it would actually be the same as the Ketores, where was the din from Chadosh and Ketores is not going to get under a Kohanim. The idea that every single day, as the Mishnah tells us, they would announce who's new to do the Ketores, that referred to regular Kohanim. But that restriction did not apply to the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol could elect to do the Ketores whenever he wanted. And so the same thing would apply to Yosef, who is the leader of Egypt, and therefore considered effectively the same as a Moreh de Asra, and therefore he has the right to be able to do a Sandakos for more than one son. Third halachic perspective, from Targum Onkelos to Pirish Rashi, came up from the Pasuk Adin in Hilchos Talmud Torah, from the perspective that Onkelos and and Rashi put forward, which is that Yosef educated his great-grandchildren. That teaches us a lesson about teaching Torah. From the Pasuk, the Pasuk in Vayechi, which says that you should teach your children and your children's children, that we have a responsibility not only to educate our children, but our grandchildren as well. Question is, when it comes to a great grandchild, the halach is, as says the only person who has the requirement to teach a great grandchild is somebody who is considered a teacher in the community already, and therefore has a responsibility to educate people across the board because they're a great chacham. Because if a person has the responsibility to teach, obviously you prioritize your own family. But if there are other scholars in the community who are more advanced than you are, which means you now don't have the responsibility to teach because there are more proficient people who should be teaching. Then a great-grandfather is exempt from teaching his great-grandson. That's the strict halacha. Whereas, when you look at the perspective of Onkelos and Rashi, that Yosef did engage in the education and raising of the children of Machir ben Menashe, which implies if he was raising them, he obviously learned Torah with them. That gives us a different halachic perspective. In other words, that a great-grandfather should actually take responsibility to teach a great-grandson. But Pashtus is mashma Yosef is nigiven mechuyev tzelenim talmidim b'chalal. We could argue that Yosef had good reason to be exempt from being the teacher of Torah to that generation. Firstly, because there's Yehuda. Yehuda was running a yeshiva. The son of Goshen, as the pasuk tells us, that Yaakov Avinu sent Yehuda ahead to establish a yeshiva in Goshen before the Jews got there. And says Mistaver as Yehuda was hot the Aliyaron on Gefrita yeshiva is given God b'chachma mimenu, and it only stands to reason that Yehuda, who's running a yeshiva, is a greater Torah scholar at that point, and Yosef isn't. Therefore, he has the responsibility to teach Torah, not Yosef. And base. As already mentioned, Yosef is so busy, he's running the country, he's got to look after his family. As the expression goes, he is somebody who is dedicated to the needs of the community. So he is exempt from having to teach students, including his great-grandchildren. So why, according to Onkelos and Rashi, is Yosef then learning with his great-grandson? Well, that clearly shows you that Rashi's opinion is he obviously takes the view that a great-grandfather has the same responsibility to teach his great-grandchildren as a grandfather has to teach his grandchildren. Which is why Yosef taught Torah to his great-grandchildren. Now that has a lesson for us. We have a practical lesson. Let's say a person is fortunate enough to live long enough to have great-grandchildren. Then you've got to take advantage. Say, Hashem gave me a big bracha. I need to use that bracha to be able to teach them Torah. And let's say the person is unable to. He doesn't have the strength. So he's not suited to teach them. Well, then you've got to give a big contribution to the yeshivas that will educate your great-grandchildren. Especially when you consider what Chazal tell us about Yaakov Avinu. That just like Yaakov Avinu's descendants are alive, he is considered alive. When we say his children, we don't just mean his children or even just his grandchildren. We mean all of the generations to follow, obviously including his great-grandchildren. Therefore, a person, even if they're a great-grandfather, has to do everything in their power to ensure that their great-grandchildren are alive, which means that they're learning Torah properly. Not only because it's in the interest of those children, but it's even in the interest of the great-grandfather himself, because if the children are alive, he too is alive. And so clearly there's a tremendous responsibility that we all have to the chinuch of our descendants as far as we possibly could reach.